It all began on an ordinary Tuesday morning in a quiet suburban neighborhood where everything seemed perfectly manicured. Trimmed lawns, pastel-colored mailboxes, and houses lined up like a postcard. The neighborhood was known for its strict HOA rules, which residents often grumbled about but quietly accepted. That is, everyone except Karen. She was the type of homeowner who saw the rules as suggestions when they didn't align with her personal vision of authority. She had been a source of minor friction for months, a constant presence at HOA meetings, insisting on fines for even the smallest deviations, and always positioning herself as the neighborhood watchdog. At first, it started small. A misplaced garden gnome, a slightly overgrown hedge, a car parked a few inches over the line. These were trivial matters, but Karen treated them like acts of war. She seemed to thrive on the tension her strict adherence to the HOA rules created, and soon, she had earned a reputation as the neighborhood's ultimate enforcer. Most residents had learned to quietly comply with her demands, wishing they could avoid her wrath entirely. But that Tuesday, things escalated in a way no one could have predicted. You see, I had recently purchased a small piece of land adjacent to my property. It wasn't much, just a narrow strip that connected my backyard to a quiet alleyway. I had every right to it, legally and officially documented in my property deed. It was meant to be a private space, a simple walkway to store garden equipment and perhaps enjoy a bit of solitude away from the prying eyes of neighbors. Karen, however, had noticed this small piece of property and immediately began plotting. Within a week, she decided to construct a fence that not only marked the boundary, but completely blocked access to my property. It was audacious even for her. The fence was an imposing structure, high enough to obscure vision, and installed at a deliberate angle that denied me entry to the alleyway entirely. When I first saw it, I couldn't believe my eyes. My own property had effectively been taken hostage by a self-appointed neighborhood tyrant. The HOA, predictably, remained neutral. They claimed that the fence was a civil matter between neighbors, effectively washing their hands of the situation. And so, I was left with a literal wall in front of my backyard, and the knowledge that Karen had done this purely to assert dominance. It wasn't about aesthetics or safety. This was personal. For several days, I tried to reason with her indirectly, sending polite letters, asking neighbors to mediate, and even suggesting a compromise. None of it worked. Karen ignored every attempt, treating my efforts as if they were irrelevant inconveniences. She seemed to relish the idea that I had been physically locked out of a part of my own property. Every glance toward the fence was a reminder of the absurdity of the situation. My rightful land had been overtaken by sheer audacity and entitlement. As the days passed, my frustration grew, but so did my determination. I began documenting everything meticulously. Photographs, legal documents, measurements, and a detailed timeline of events. If Karen thought she could intimidate me with a fence, she was gravely mistaken. I knew the law was on my side, but I also understood that legal action could be slow, tedious, and expensive. I needed a plan that would accomplish two things: reclaim my property and expose Karen's overreach to the entire neighborhood. Meanwhile, word of the fence spread. Neighbors who had previously avoided conflict began to take notice. Some quietly sympathized, while others openly ridiculed Karen behind her back. Social media posts began circulating with pictures of the fence, and commentary quickly painted a picture of a woman whose obsession with control had gone too far. The neighborhood that once quietly endured her meddling was starting to question her authority, and the momentum was slowly shifting. By the end of the first week, the tension reached a boiling point. Karen seemed almost cocky, convinced that the fence was her ultimate statement, a demonstration of her ability to bend the rules in her favor. But behind her confident demeanor, I noticed subtle cracks. Small gestures of irritation, a tightening in her tone during HOA meetings, and the occasional glare from neighbors who had begun to whisper about her behavior. It was clear that my next steps would have to be deliberate, clever, and unassailable. This wasn't just about property anymore. It was about reputation, control, and the unspoken rules of social power in a neighborhood that prided itself on conformity. And so, I began the first stage of my plan. I researched every local ordinance regarding property access, fence placement, and HOA regulations. I contacted a surveyor to verify boundaries and documented every inch of my land. I began quietly collecting evidence that would make any legal challenge against me impossible. At the same time, I started drafting a strategy to leverage social pressure, knowing that Karen's need for approval and recognition could be used against her. The stage was set, and what seemed like a minor dispute over a fence was about to escalate into a full-blown neighborhood saga. The tension simmered, the stakes grew higher, and the absurdity of a single fence blocking an entire property became the centerpiece of a battle that would soon draw the attention of everyone living on the street. And yet, despite the planning and preparation, I could feel a thrill of anticipation. There was something almost cinematic about the injustice, the audacity, and the eventual reckoning that was waiting to unfold. Karen had built a wall to assert power, but every wall, no matter how imposing, has a weakness. And I had already started finding hers. The first chapter of this suburban war was over, but the battle had only just begun. The fence stood, imposing and proud, a monument to one woman's sense of authority. Yet behind its wooden panels, the seeds of defeat had already been planted. And as I stepped back to assess the scene, I realized that the next move would be the most satisfying one of all, the moment when audacity meets accountability. The fence stood as a silent monument to Karen's hubris, towering over my property like a wooden blockade daring me to react. But by now, it was clear that this was no longer a mere property dispute. It had become a psychological battle. Every day as I walked past that barrier, I could feel its weight. Not just physically, but socially. Karen had believed she could impose control simply by placing boards and nails along a boundary line, but I had other ideas. I started small. Every photo I took of the fence, every measurement, every official document was cataloged in meticulous detail. Each piece of evidence would later serve to prove that the fence was not just a petty annoyance, but an illegal obstruction that infringed upon my rights as a property owner. While I worked quietly, the neighborhood buzzed. Rumors traveled fast, as neighbors began to share whispers of Karen's latest stunt. Some offered subtle support, discreetly checking to see if I had the documentation in order. Others couldn't resist posting photos on social media, subtly framing the story as Karen takes control to absurd lengths. Karen, meanwhile, seemed oblivious to the growing scrutiny. She strutted past her own fence with a sense of superiority, occasionally waving to HOA members who nodded in polite agreement, or perhaps polite fear. But the cracks in her armor were starting to appear. She underestimated the power of a meticulously documented, patient, and strategic response. She had assumed that fear and intimidation would protect her, but intimidation has its limits, and patience is a weapon stronger than any wooden board. By the second week, I decided to escalate the response. I began sending formal letters to both the HOA and the city zoning office, outlining the precise legal violations the fence represented. I included photographs, maps, and citations of municipal ordinances. I did not approach this lightly. Every detail was verified, every claim carefully supported. This was not a fight based on emotion. It was a fight grounded in law, evidence, and undeniable fact. Karen's reaction, when it finally came, was immediate and dramatic. She stormed through the neighborhood as though announcing her triumph, proclaiming that she was within her rights and that anyone questioning her authority would face consequences. But the effect was the opposite of what she intended. Neighbors who had previously avoided confrontation were now openly skeptical. Conversations at morning jogs, in driveway chats, and even casual gatherings at the mailbox revealed a growing sentiment. Karen had overstepped. The social pressure began to work subtly at first. One neighbor, who had always feared her, quietly shared documents showing that her own property boundaries had been verified, and that Karen's fence encroached on another parcel of land as well. Another neighbor, who had endured years of fines and scolding from Karen, began offering support, providing eyewitness testimony that reinforced the legal evidence I had already gathered. Every piece of information, every whispered confirmation, slowly chipped away at the narrative Karen had tried to construct, that of a ruler imposing order on a chaotic neighborhood. But Karen, true to form, did not retreat quietly. She escalated in her own way, posting notices around the neighborhood claiming that I had illegally trespassed, and accusing me of violating HOA regulations. It was a desperate move, an attempt to rewrite the narrative, but it lacked credibility. Anyone who had been following the events closely could see the absurdity. The fence itself stood as irrefutable proof of her audacity, a silent testament to her attempt to overreach. To this point, I decided it was time for the most strategic part of the plan: leverage. While legal processes could take months, if not years, public exposure could accelerate consequences. I documented everything, not just for city officials, but for the community. A timeline was constructed, showing Karen's obsessive focus on control and her deliberate blocking of my property. This was no petty disagreement over landscaping. It was a clear pattern of overreach, intimidation, and disregard for law and neighborly conduct. Then came the turning point. During an HOA meeting, the evidence was presented in a neutral, factual way. I laid out the timeline, the photographs, the legal ordinances, and the testimony from other residents. The room, which had previously been hesitant to confront Karen, went silent. There was no cheering, no dramatic gestures, just a collective recognition that something had crossed the line. Karen's confident posture faltered. The smugness she had relied upon to intimidate others began to crumble, replaced with a subtle anxiety that betrayed her awareness of the growing opposition. The HOA, forced to respond, opened an official review of the fence. Inspectors were sent to the property, confirming what I had already documented. Karen's structure was in violation of zoning regulations. It encroached on my legal property, and it had been installed without proper permits. Every detail reinforced the reality that she had acted unilaterally, without authority, and against the documented rights of a neighbor. Social momentum also shifted rapidly. The whispers of ridicule transformed into visible support for my case. Neighbors began taking photos, recording video, and even commenting on social media posts about the audacity of the fence. Karen, who had thought she could control the narrative, now faced a reality she could not manipulate. The more she insisted on her authority, the more obvious it became to everyone watching that she had overstepped. The tension reached its peak one morning when an inspector arrived, clipboard in hand. Karen attempted to intimidate the official, claiming that the fence was within her rights. But the documentation was overwhelming. Measurements were taken, boundaries verified, and photographs logged. In a matter of hours, it was confirmed. The fence was illegal. Every plank, every post, every nail was now evidence against her. The momentum of authority had shifted irrevocably. By the end of the chapter, the neighborhood had witnessed a remarkable transformation. Karen, once the undisputed enforcer of rules, now faced scrutiny, legal challenges, and a growing reputation for audacity that backfired spectacularly. The fence, which had been a symbol of power, was now a monument to hubris, a physical reminder of how entitlement, when unchecked, can spiral into public humiliation. The stage was set for the final act. The legal and social pressures combined had created a situation where Karen's actions could no longer stand unchallenged. What remained was the ultimate confrontation, the moment when the consequences of overreach would collide with the carefully prepared response. The neighborhood held its breath, waiting for the resolution that had been building since the very day the first plank of wood went into the ground. And as I looked at the fence, tall and imposing yet legally and socially compromised, I realized that the endgame was near. Karen's reign of control was about to be undone, not with anger or confrontation, but with methodical strategy, undeniable evidence, and the subtle power of public accountability. The countdown had begun. The days following the inspector's visit were a delicate mix of anticipation and quiet triumph. Karen still strutted around the neighborhood, her confidence visibly strained, but everyone could sense the shift. What had begun as a petty feud over a fence had grown into a full-blown saga of accountability, law, and public opinion. The psychological weight of the situation had shifted entirely. Where once Karen dominated the social hierarchy, she now faced scrutiny at every glance, every conversation, every whispered remark in the street. The HOA, finally forced to act, issued a formal notice. The fence must be removed immediately. It was a short document, cold and official, but it carried immense power. Every word struck at the core of Karen's audacity. The inspector's measurements, photographs, and detailed reports were included, leaving no room for debate. The notice was not just a directive. It was a statement that authority could not be wielded unilaterally, and that even the most self-assured neighborhood enforcer could be held accountable when rules and evidence demanded it. Karen's initial reaction was predictable. She attempted to appeal, drafting letters filled with legal jargon and accusations of bias. But the evidence against her was unassailable. Every board, every post, every nail had been documented. Surveys and property deeds confirmed the facts. Neighbors, previously hesitant to engage, now watched as her attempts to resist enforcement fell flat. The social momentum, combined with official documentation, had created an unstoppable force. Then came the most satisfying moment. The day the removal crew arrived, Karen appeared on her porch, arms crossed, trying to project calm authority. But the facade cracked almost immediately. The sheer logistics of dismantling her self-constructed monument were overwhelming. Boards came down, posts were uprooted, and the imposing structure that had blocked my property for weeks was reduced, plank by plank, to nothing more than a scattered heap on her front lawn. It was a slow, almost theatrical process, each sound of hammering and sawing punctuating the collapse of her overconfidence. Neighbors emerged from their homes, cameras in hand. Some recorded videos, some snapped photos, while others simply watched, absorbing the spectacle. Karen's attempts to assert control had become a form of entertainment for the community. Whispers of amusement and disbelief traveled quickly. Her obsession with authority, once intimidating, had turned her into the subject of collective ridicule as the last sections of the fence were removed. It became clear that the power dynamics of the neighborhood had shifted irreversibly. Karen had attempted to dominate through audacity and intimidation, but she had underestimated the combination of careful planning, legal evidence, and community accountability. The physical barrier she had erected was gone, but the symbolic impact was far greater. Her authority, once unquestioned, had been publicly dismantled. In the aftermath, the neighborhood buzzed with discussions about the events. Conversations at mailboxes, in driveways, and over backyard fences all referenced the now legendary incident. Karen, once a feared figure, became a cautionary tale, proof that unchecked entitlement and overreach carry consequences. Social media posts circulated with before and after photos of the fence, commentary about her audacity, and videos documenting the removal process. The story spread beyond the street, becoming a viral example of how community, law, and strategy can triumph over arrogance. For my part, I reclaimed my property fully. The narrow strip that had been blocked for weeks was now open, accessible, and clearly part of my legal domain. But the victory was about more than access. It was a reaffirmation of principle. Karen's fence had been an attempt to assert dominance through fear, but the combination of evidence, patience, and strategic planning had transformed her overreach into a spectacle of accountability. Over the next few weeks, the neighborhood returned to a semblance of normalcy. The lawns were trimmed, the hedges pruned, and the small piece of property that had sparked such drama became a quiet space once more. Yet the lessons lingered. Karen had learned, whether willingly or not, that actions have consequences, that authority cannot exist in isolation, and that social and legal frameworks can overpower even the most confident assertions of control. For everyone watching the saga unfold, it became a story of satisfaction, of justice served not through confrontation or anger, but through careful planning, documentation, and a methodical approach. The fence, once a symbol of audacity and intimidation, was now a reminder of how power can shift when patience meets strategy. The audacious attempt to dominate had failed spectacularly, and the neighborhood's balance of social authority had been restored. Karen, left to survey the remains of her failed project, was visibly shaken. Her posture, once rigid with confidence, now betrayed frustration and disbelief. She had tried to assert control, to bend reality to her will, but the combination of law, planning, and community accountability had proven unstoppable. Every neighbor who had quietly supported my efforts now looked at her with a mixture of amusement and relief, witnessing the tangible consequences of entitlement gone too far. As the sun set on the street, the wooden planks of the fence lay scattered in the grass, a monument to her audacity and my strategic patience. The battle had been won, but more than that, it had become a story, a viral, unforgettable narrative of hubris, persistence, and justice. The fence was gone. Karen had been owned in the most public and undeniable way, and the neighborhood would remember this saga for years to come. And so, the final act of this suburban drama came to an end. The property was reclaimed, the social order restored, and the lesson clear. No amount of entitlement can withstand evidence, strategy, and the quiet power of a community united by reason and law. Karen's fence had fallen, but the story, with its mix of absurdity, audacity, and ultimate accountability, would live on. An enduring example of how patience, planning, and persistence can turn even the most intimidating obstacle into a moment of triumph. The battle was over. The fence was gone, and the neighborhood finally could breathe again.